Good morning. Today I'm going to be talking about a book by Claire KAthleen Ward. It's called Drawing and Painting Fungi, an artist's guide to finding and illustrating mushrooms and lichens. So I've read through the whole book a couple of times now and taken notes on what I thought was the most pertinent information, and I used the advice given by Kathleen to find and illustrate a mushroom. Identifying mushrooms is something that I want to improve on, and there are 2 chapters in the book dedicated specifically to mushroom species and their identifying factors. First, I want to share a quote from the book that I particularly liked. It reads, "But capturing their myriad forms by painting them is not the whole story. First, there's the thrill of hunting for them, as if on a quest for hidden treasures, and you just never know what you're going to find. Then comes the research and challenge of identification. It's all a part of the adventure and the uncovering of their fascinating lives. Time is of the essence, as they are ephemeral and can rot down and vanish quickly, disappearing back into the earth and leaf litter as if they were never there at all." The book covers all the many different materials you may choose to find and illustrate your mushrooms. My list of materials is very succinct. I use watercolor paints, and I've recently begun using graphite pencils. In the book you can find information on using gouache, watercolor, graphite pencils, types of paper, setting up a studio space, and even using fungi ink. It's been on my to-do list for a while to make fungi ink. There's an old stump in my yard where common ink cap mushrooms fruit several times a year, so I'm just waiting for them to come back so I can collect them and make ink out of them. I think this chapter is a great introduction for people who aren't familiar with the various forms of tools that you can use in your art. Especially if you're a beginner, it can be kind of overwhelming deciding what it is that you want to do and how you want to create. There's so many methods out there. I would suggest picking a few to try to get started in your making, so you can figure out which of those materials you enjoy using and which you don't, and any that you dislike you can replace with new tools. And then you can keep doing that until you discover which tools you feel comfortable using or which tools you enjoy using. Of course, you can just start with a piece of paper and a pencil. You don't have to overthink it. As I said earlier, this is the part that I need the most help with. I can find them easily enough, but identifying them is quite tricky. In this particularly beautiful chapter, you can find tips on identifying different mushrooms, like noticing the stipe, bruising, smell, habitat. Something I feel can be overlooked when discussing nature illustration is the tools you can use before you ever sit down to draw. Tools like magnifying glass and guidebooks. Claire includes a section called Things That May Be Useful to Take Out With You, and my favorite on the list is the first item. A bag or basket which can hold containers in to protect them while in transit. I've discussed this in a video before, but that method reminds me of Janet Marsh, who would collect specimens in the river in glass jars and then take them back to her studio to study them. And it's something I've wanted to do for a while, but I've never thought of collecting mushrooms that way. I wonder if there's a way to permanently preserve mushrooms in jars as a part of your nature collection. Something you can do after bringing your specimens back to your studio is create a spore print. I've done that here with a false parasol mushroom. Claire goes over all of the steps you need to make a successful spore print. This chapter discusses topics such as keeping a sketchbook and recording in it. This is a valuable chapter. Of course, as someone who keeps a nature journal, I believe that the act of recording our observations through whichever means we choose is of the utmost importance. The chapter also goes into detail regarding photography and working from your photographs. I believe this is another really important chapter for those who are just getting into drawing. Even though I've been making art for years, I just started monotone drawing recently. The chapter discusses typical subjects such as light and tone, drawing on toned paper, and it even gives a step-by-step instruction on how to draw a mushroom with charcoal and how to draw a mushroom on black paper. If you're an absolute beginner, I would say this is a good place to start, As I stated earlier, the easiest tools to use are paper and pencil, so I feel starting an artistic journey with monotone drawing is typical. Color theory is something that has always been used by artists because it's useful. Even if you're beyond the beginner stage, you still use color theory, even if it's not something you ever really think about. There's a quote from the Colors of Fungi section that I thought was lovely. Colors of fungi bring to mind autumnal hues of browns, siennas, umbers, caramels, and buffs, echoing the russet and golden shades of the turning of the trees. And then it goes on to discuss more vibrant and colorful species like waxcaps and amanitas. So maybe earthy tones are the first thing you think about when you think of painting mushrooms, but the whole palette is used, even purples and blues. Something I enjoy doing when I can is painting imperfections, cuts and missing pieces and holes. And one way you can bring more color to your painting is by studying a species that exhibits bruising when cut. If you want to test if a mushroom exhibits bruising, you can cut or rip a piece off of it, and don't feel bad for doing that either, because bruising is one of the ways to identify a mushroom species. So it's useful in that way too. Another section found in this chapter is watercolor painting on wet paper, or wet on wet painting. And there's also a section on wet on dry painting. Dry brushing is another interesting technique. Whenever I think of dry brushing, I think of Beatrix Potter. She was known to use a dry brushing technique in a lot of her paintings. And as we know, Beatrix was notorious for being a mycologist and making beautiful mycological illustrations. So I'm sure she was also using a dry brushing technique in a lot of her mushroom paintings. I've been moving into more dry brushing as well. I think it's a great way to get more detail, and also just to be mindful of where you're putting color down. This was an especially beautiful and interesting chapter, and so in-depth it could be a book of its own. This chapter is moving on from the basics now and getting into elements that you can add to make your composition more beautiful or to add more information about the habitat that the mushroom was found in. This feels like one of the shorter chapters, but it might be one of my favorites. Adding habitat information to your mushroom paintings adds interest and detail. This chapter covers mushrooms with gills, such as amanitas, waxcaps, russulas, and ink caps, mushrooms with spores, or boletes, and finally mushrooms with spines, like the hedgehog fungus. This chapter covers mushrooms that don't fit into the generic mushroom shape. Mushrooms like brackets, jellies, and corals, and gastromycetes, which are funguses that keep their spores in pouches, like the puffball, and earth stars, and bird's nest fungi, and stinkhorns. This chapter covers more unusual species of fungi, including earth tongues, which I didn't even know was a thing, eyelash fungus, candle snuff fungus, and the chapter ends with a reminder that some species of mushrooms are so tiny and overlooked that it's hard to study them by eye. This is where a microscope comes in handy. This is the last chapter in the book, and it covers types of lichen, contemporary lichen art, and illustrating lichens yourself with various materials. Do you guys say lichens or lichens? I feel like sometimes I say lichens and sometimes I say lichens. I think both are accepted pronunciations of the word. So to recap, yes, I think this book is useful and beautiful and full of so much information. I'm a big believer in continuing to learn, and that's something that kind of comes naturally. Humans are a curious species, but I feel intentional learning is one of the most important things that you can do for yourself regarding any subject. Even if you think that you know everything, or even if you do know everything that's in a specific book or a specific video or a specific podcast, I still feel there's importance there. Just absorbing someone else talk about it can inspire and motivate and help you come up with brand new ideas that excite you. So this book definitely did that for me. Maybe this video is doing that for you right now. If you're interested in finding and painting mushrooms, which I assume you are because you're watching this video, I think this book would be a great addition to your bookshelf. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed what I had to say, and I hope you've been inspired to read this book yourself or to go out in search of some mushrooms to study. I will see you in my next video. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.